Hi, my name is Lew Blank.
And I'm Tyler Wendland.
And this is the Outsiders recap and analysis of the 2018 midterms. Today is November 7th, 2018. The midterms were yesterday, and we're going to break it down.
Yes. We watched Needle Jitter. We had a lot of coffee last night. And we're dealing with the results.
Yeah, it was quite a night. I was at the DFL party. So DFL, for people not in Minnesota, Democratic Farmer Labor Party, which is affiliated with the Democratic Party. I was at their party in St. Paul, and we saw Tina Smith and Amy Klobuchar and Ilhan Omar and Tim Walz speak. And Tyler hosted his own party.
I was in my apartment shouting at my TV.
It was pretty intense. So first of all, I guess the first question is what was surprising from last night? I would say personally, not that much. I thought it actually went pretty much as expected. If you look at a lot of the political reports, 538 Cook, it pretty much aligned with a lot of it. There were a few toss-ups or lean elections that went the other way of the slight tilt. But overall, no huge upsets, I would say.
I wouldn't say there's many big upsets. I do think there were some surprises, though. I believe there was a House seat in Oklahoma that flipped that almost no one saw coming. Kendra Horn defeated Steve Russell. That was a surprise. I think as far as polling error, Florida is always a close election, but Andrew Gillum, who was a Democrat, led in almost every public poll after the primary, and he still came up short about 1% in the final result. Same for Bill Nelson. That was probably the biggest senatorial surprise. There were a lot of red state senators who that are Democrats who ended up underperforming their polls, but perhaps that was just, that was anticipated by most of pundits, and it was kind of seen as, they were in trouble. So that was probably not too much of a surprise. Some seats, I was surprised to see the margins on them were so small or so large. For example, in Kansas, the Democrat defeated Chris Kobach overwhelmingly, over 50%, and it was supposed to be, I think 538 had an exact tie before that. So surprises up and down, nothing out of the ordinary, but it will shake out Washington, that's for sure. Yeah,
I think the Tester election was a lot closer, although it looks like he's pulling that out.
He's done that before.
Yeah. And I think the margin also on the Braun-Donnelly election might have been a bit stronger in favor of Braun than a lot of people might have expected.
That was the first surprise of the night. Indiana is usually the first state that polls close, and I think that kind of set an ominous tone for red state Democrats last night.
Definitely, and also you mentioned Gillum. I think there was kind of an unexpected downfall for black progressives. Both him and Abrams in Georgia did not do as well as a lot of people thought they would. So did you see any patterns regarding different demographics, race, gender, and age? I mean, I would say in terms of gender, we had both more women candidates and more women voters. And in terms of age, a lot of young adult turnout. But it wasn't enough to counter the Republican turnout in a way that would really lead to a blue tsunami, as people were calling it.
Right. I do think that there could have been, like you said, a bigger blue tsunami had Republicans not done. I mean, the Republicans turned out. We'll know exactly turnout numbers in the next coming days, but this could have been a much worse night for Republicans. This was, if anything, it was pretty tame compared to some of the blue wave scenarios. As far as demographics goes, I think women are some of the real victors of last night. A lot of the suburban districts that we've seen flip have had women candidates. A lot of these areas are suburban women, suburban white women, particularly, and suburban women of color, who have kind of coalesced, and these are in areas that perhaps voted for Mitt Romney in 2012 over Obama and have now kind of shifted to Hillary Clinton in 2016. We're seeing that trend continue, and that helped flip quite a few House seats last night. Young people, I don't know the exact numbers yet, I don't know if anyone does, but from what I think exit polls showed and what polls showed before, is millennial turnout was much higher than previous midterms, but there is that there is still kind of that counterweight from older people, and that while younger people do vote more progressive, there is still a shift of this white working class male that has dominated and is becoming more Republican as the years go on.
Yeah, definitely. I think there was a lot of, you mentioned the Romney-Clinton districts,
yes.
And I think there's a lot of suspicion that the Obama-Trump districts would really go Democrat and go in a very populist Democrat direction, and we didn't really see that. And yeah, regarding gender, I think the number is we're looking at over 100 new representatives who are women, which is really impressive.
Very cool.
Yeah. And now some of the big issues that I think really affected the Republican turnout, I would say the appointment of Justice Kavanaugh was one of the big things that solidified the Republican support. I think the Democrats that were affected and polarized by it may have already been planning on voting Democrat, and I don't know how much that influenced their turnout, but I would say we definitely saw an increase in approval for Trump after the Kavanaugh appointment. And as a result, I think that is one of the reasons that the blue wave was not as strong as it possibly could have been.
It definitely put a lot of red state Democrats in the Senate in kind of a bind. I think that would have been, we had a handful who voted for Justice Gorsuch and against Justice Kavanaugh, and they try to downplay it as, we pick who's best for the country, but for a lot of those states and those voters who support Trump and see that as kind of a binary choice, that wasn't enough. And I think while Kavanaugh perhaps may have had an opposite effect for women and younger voters as being a mobilizer, that doesn't quite balance out in terms of the Senate. There are more people who are negatively affected by the Kavanaugh hearings and such that are in less, I guess, beneficial states for them.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I would say that, and I would add, looking at social and economic issues, I think leading up to the midterms, Trump strategically focused on social issues, or issues that are typically regarded as social issues, like the Supreme Court and like immigration regarding the caravan. And I would argue that Democrats are really winning on economic issues in large part. I think Trump's tariffs have been unpopular. I think a lot of his health initiatives have been unpopular. People are realizing the ways that the ACA benefits them, and the GOP attempts to strike it down may not be good for Republican voter turnout. So I think Trump's focus on Kavanaugh, immigration, and other domestic, more social type issues over economic issues might have been one of the reasons that Democrats did not have an extraordinary performance in the House, and they actually did a bit less than they were projected to do in the Senate.
I think Trump is extremely good at winning culture wars. He is, it's what he does best. It's how he won the primary, it's how he won the election in some respects. And there's evidence now that he's able to do it, at least to some extent, provide a victory in the midterms, and that has its benefits and its cost when you make your election about cultural things, about stopping caravans and things that doesn't transfer into policy.
Yeah.
And that ends up being, what have we really accomplished in 4 years? But maybe that's not what people want. Maybe people want to have something to argue about like this, and maybe governing comes second in these elections.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think Trump is really underrated in his messaging abilities, and I think credit where credit is due for the GOP, because, with all of the record voter turnout, at least record in near recent history, voter turnout that we've been seeing among especially youth and women voters, and to some extent people of color, the fact that the GOP actually in some ways outshot their projections is really impressive, and you gotta give credit to Trump and the GOP's messaging and campaign tactics. And now we're going to move on to some video clips that we will reflect on. This morning at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, there was a panel hosted by University of Minnesota professor Larry Jacobs, and on the panel was newly elected Congresswoman from Minnesota 5, Ilhan Omar. We have former Minnesota Congressman Vin Weber, Minnesota Executive Director of WIN, Denise Cardinal, and GOP consultant Ben Golnick. And the four of them were on the panel and they answered some questions. First of all, let's go to Ilhan Omar as she speaks about how what the Democrats' values are affects the results of midterm elections. And we will also see a counter from Vin Weber saying that it's not necessarily what the candidates are in favor of, but rather a reflection on the negatives of the presidency.
We have been part, right, of this resistance the last 2 years to this politics of fear and the policies that are very destructive that are coming out of this administration. But we recognize that there is an opportunity for us to actually insist on a set of values that we know that the voters are interested in. And I think when there is an opportunity and a window, you take that. Because for the first time, I feel like we have an opportunity to talk to people about a different kind of progress that our country can really have, where we can have real investments in infrastructure and 21st century infrastructure, where we have real opportunities to make sure that here in the United States, no one should be worried about filing for bankruptcy because they get sick. Here in America, we should really have an opportunity for all of our young people to have a future that isn't shackled with student debt.
The progressive Democrats had a clear agenda. It's not necessarily my agenda, but it was clear. And I don't think anybody else in this, otherwise the election seemed to me to be largely devoid of clear substantive direction. The only thing I would say about that is, it's not unusual for a midterm election to be driven that way. My view of midterm election, we all would like to be positive and think that our elections are conducted on a positive, hopeful plan. Midterm elections, I think, are largely grievance elections. The marginal voters that turn out not because they're voting in favor of something they're excited about. You're maybe the exception, but they turn out because they're mad about something.
Yeah, so those are two pretty much entirely polar opposite views. I would say in terms of the midterms, these midterms specifically, I'd say that Weber is more accurate because I wouldn't say there was really an ideological takeaway, a strong ideological takeaway anyway, that you could take from this election, because you had moderates and centrist Democrats losing in Donnelly, in Sinema, in Nelson, and in Heitkamp, and in McCaskill. But you also had progressive losses with Gillum and Abrams and Beto O'Rourke, although he actually performed exactly about where he was polling. So when you look at that, I would not say that there is a strong ideological split in these midterm results. In that case, Weber is right. But in terms of the presidential election, I would say Omar might have something more to say about that, because I would say presidential elections are much less reflection of how the current presidency is doing.
I think I mostly agree with what Weber said. I think every political party wants their positions to be what rides them to victory, and that's not always the case. I think when the GOP won the House in the early 90s, for the first time in 50 years, they had this contract with America. They talked about the things they would do in the House. And I think it ended up being that the most Americans didn't know what the contract was. But it was what they campaigned on, but it didn't matter. Things with President Clinton probably put them over the edge anyway. And, well, political parties love to have their messaging as what turns people out. A lot of times it is the unpopular president, or it's just changing attitudes or changing demographics, I think all of which filtered into this last election. I think what Congressman-elect Omar says about perhaps showing what the Democratic Party has to offer is something that should not be ignored. I think the Democrats have been out of power legislatively, in the House at least, for 8 years, and this gives them kind of a chance to kind of show people what they've got in terms of policy and things. Not necessarily in what gets passed, but in what gets presented. I do think that means they have to be careful with that. There's an argument to be made that when the GOP did the same thing in 2010, they pushed too far. They got seen as perhaps too extreme, and that might have hurt them in 2012. But definitely will be a chance to see what the Democrats have to offer in terms of infrastructure, in terms of healthcare, in terms of a balance to the GOP's influence the last couple of years.
I definitely think so. I think what Omar is saying might actually have some influence on these midterms, but not necessarily in the way that she's stating. I think in the individual races, I don't think what she's saying applies directly in this specific midterm. But I think in terms of the generic ballot between Democrats and Republicans, I think the Democrats should have more of a unified message, or something that people can actually point to the Democratic Party and say, that's what the Democrats stand for. I think we definitely have that with the GOP. I think we know that Trump is in favor of deregulation, and in terms of Trump specifically, in favor of tariffs. And he's in favor of a border wall. He's in favor of all of these things. He's not in favor of the ACA. I think the Democrats are not as strong as what they actually believe in, not just rejecting what Trump is doing, but actually having a very specific platform of their own. And I think that can go very powerfully in terms of expanding voter turnout. When people see Democrats as not just the resistance to Trump and the GOP, but actually as a force themselves that's advocating for a specific worldview that can actually latch on to people's enthusiasm and inspire voter turnout, I think that can be very powerful. Obviously, that's going to work differently in different states. Red states are going to be less responsive to a unified progressive message, while blue states and blue districts will accept it more easily. But I think having that strong, solid vision can appeal, especially if it's based on fundamental elements that most people agree on. 90% of Americans support universal background checks. About over half of Americans support Medicare for all. More than 60% of Americans support legalizing marijuana, and majority support infrastructure spending, which Ilhan Omar mentioned. And I think if those issues are focused on, and Democrats really are perceived as a party that's seeking something, not just rejecting something, I think that can lead to enthusiasm and future victories. What do you think?
I think wanting to reject something is what got the GOP to become so powerful after 6 years under Obama. I wonder if it's we love to think of a silver bullet that gets campaigns to work and what gets people to turn out to vote. I don't think one exists really. I will say that I think that my intuition coming into this election was that the Democrats would be better off as a big tent party, as one that could appeal to those suburban women that that voted more for Hillary Clinton, as well as those elusive Obama-Trump voters. There was my belief that the Democrats could probably use positions like pre-existing conditions to perhaps take the best of both sides. That didn't happen. We saw kind of a shift of those red state Obama-Trump supporters kind of still going away from the Democratic Party, and those suburban areas going more to the Democrats. Perhaps it's time to rethink the big tent, and maybe obviously Democratic voters are not Republican voters, and if Republican voters were able to be energized for 8 years under Obama on repealing Obamacare, that might not have the same effect on Democratic voters. They're not going to. They might not turn out just because it's against Trump. They want results. They want health care and a higher minimum wage, and Democrats are going to have to cater to that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, especially about the Obama-Trump voters and pre-existing conditions. I would label a lot of the Obama-Trump voters as more of a populist demographic, and I think pre-existing conditions is one that would appeal to that populist sentiment. I also think infrastructure spending might be a big one. Whereas for the Romney-Clinton voters, that's more of a suburban, more affluent type of demographic, and I think in 2020, I think they'll be repelled by Trump's personality to a large extent. But in races with more establishment Republicans, I do think that's more of an establishment supporting demographic. So as Democrats, you have to balance that. Do you want to energize your base and Obama-Trump voters, or do you want to appeal to those kind of middle, more establishment Romney-Clinton voters? In my opinion, there's more to be had with independents, Obama-Trump voters, and the Democratic base, which in my opinion would be more receptive to a message that is populist and is advocating for a policy. The one drawback is losing potentially those Romney-Clinton voters. And now for our final segment, we would like to talk about some state and local initiatives, starting with the Florida ballot measure, which is going to really change electoral politics.
So in most states, an overwhelming majority, if you are a felon and you've served your time, you're re-enfranchised, you're given the right to vote back. A lot of southern states have rejected this idea, and it's technically constitutional, citation needed. Florida was one of those states that did not give back your right to vote unless you appeared in front of a panel. I believe the governor is in charge of that, and under Governor Rick Scott, I believe out of 1.5 million disenfranchised people, only about 3,000 got their voting rights back. So this amendment would and will be implemented. It got the amount of votes needed to pass. Will basically automatically grant them their right to vote, which has a massive precedent, including implications for 2020 and beyond.
Yeah, it's I believe the number is 1.5 million new people will be eligible for voting, and 538 did a bit of an analysis, and they said since ex-convicts tend to have a lower turnout rate, they're saying they estimate about a 20% turnout rate, but that still turns out to 300,000 new voters in Florida, majority Democrat. And as we saw both in the 2016 presidential election and in these 2018 midterms, both at the governor and Senate level, it's coming down to 1 point consistently in Florida. And those extra 300,000 majority Democratic voters is going to make a huge difference in Florida electoral politics for years to come. And now moving on, we want to talk a little bit about gerrymandering in the Midwest.
Yes, so one of the Republicans' biggest success stories after their 2010 capturing of the House was the capturing of many governor's seats in the Midwest. They claimed Ohio, they claimed Michigan, they claimed Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and with that came the redistricting cycle, which resulted in a massive gerrymandering, not just in the Midwest, but across the country, in terms of kind of gaming the House in their favor. Not that it's never been done before. It was just done extraordinarily well, and it was able to hold for much of the past decade. Of course, we've seen that unravel a bit, but only because the map is getting older and demographics are changing. But Democrats have been partially successful and able to combat this. Last night they took Michigan back, which is gerrymandered. They took Wisconsin back, which is gerrymandered much more at the state level than at the congressional level, but still has implications. They won re-election in Pennsylvania, which gives them a shot there. They now have the governor's race tied up last year in Virginia, which was also heavily gerrymandered. One to watch in 2 years will be North Carolina. Governor Roy Cooper won that in 2016, but he'll need to win again to keep over those maps. Those are all races that, if you unravel the congressional districts, that's about a dozen seats or so, and that can make or break a majority in Congress. Now, Democrats came short in Ohio, which has one of the most ridiculously gerrymandered seats in the country. There have been voter initiatives to come up with a more fair system, but nothing creates a fairer map than a divided government. So we'll see.
Yeah. What you do see is there was not too much of a breakdown of what 538 calls the trifectas, which is where you have governor, Senate, and House in the same party. They might have flipped party a little bit, but the fact that the three are housed under the same party has not really dissipated. And I think what you're going to see there is immense partisan control over gerrymandering in 2020. Now, there are efforts out there to pass certain constitutional amendments to stop gerrymandering, but those aren't very far underway. It's going to be, I'd say, many more years before those really get into effect. And yeah, I think what we're going to see is more partisan gerrymandering, maybe now more on the Democratic side than if this kind of blue wave hadn't happened. But I think we're still going to see a lot of partisan gerrymandering both at the state and national House level.
I think one of the bigger takeaways from this election, this has kind of been building for a while now, is that while progressive policy has been stunted on a federal level from just the Senate and the House, There's been tremendous success for progressives to enact legislation through ballot initiatives. I think that is something that's underrated but is being immensely utilized. We've seen marijuana legalized now in 1 of every 5 states. We're seeing Medicaid expanded in states where the legislation wouldn't touch it because it had Obama in the name of Obamacare. But people will vote for it, and they'll vote and they'll say yes. Now we've seen things like the redistricting reform going through and passing. Minimum wage passes at the state level, even in red states, much more than it does by expecting Congress to do it itself. It's an example probably of kind of states taking advantage of their own destiny, and it's something to look forward to if you're trying to establish policies and things at the state level to try and get that to move forward in the national level.
So that is all we have for you today. We really appreciate that you joined us watching this video, and we hope that it was at least somewhat informative and educational, and it'll give you a bit more perspective on what you can take away from these 2018 midterms.
Only a month away to the Iowa caucuses.
Oh my God, yeah. And then the Mississippi special election, which
Oh, that's
we got.
right. Don't even remind me.
That's coming up. More and more political ads and election stuff coming up soon, and we will be there providing you with some breakdown and analysis. So long, my name is Lew Blank.
I'm Tyler Wendland.
Thanks for joining us.